We have a wonderful guest here today, and what experiences you have had. Ellen Kennedy, Dr. Ellen Kennedy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
You're with World Without Genocide, correct? And you're back to tell us about another country, East Timor, right?
I took a trip this summer in June to East Timor. It's a country that most people have never heard of, so it was very challenging for us to make the decision to visit East Timor, not knowing anyone else who had ever been there. And the reason why we went is a truly compelling reason. From 1975 to 1999, this very small island nation just northeast of Australia was occupied by Indonesians, by the Indonesian government. And there was a brutal, nearly quarter-century long battle by the East Timorese against the occupiers for independence. Our organization, of course, studies genocide, teaches about genocide, and what happened in East Timor has been categorized as a genocide, and nearly 200,000 people perished during that time. So our motivation in going was to have an opportunity to see the immediate aftermath of that terrible period of conflict, and conflict that ensued after a vote for independence a few years later as well, and really to try to understand what some of the issues are, what some of the prevention strategies could have been, and then ways that we can help to spread the story of East Timor to perhaps inspire people in Minnesota and elsewhere to visit, to take action, to help lend support to some on-the-ground rebuilding.
Well, and they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? And I know you brought some photographs to show us today. So I think that's the best way to describe what you're talking about. So if you wouldn't mind showing us the photographs, we'd love to see them.
Perfect.
Now, obviously from the first picture, from the first photograph, this is kind of where we're talking about.
East Timor is a small island nation, as I said, in the Timor Sea, just northwest of Australia.
And Australia is?
Right below it.
Okay.
And it borders Indonesia, and Indonesia was the occupying country.
Okay.
East Timor had been colonized by the Portuguese, and if you recall your history, Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch. So there was always this division on the island. In 1975, the Portuguese left, and East Timor declared its independence. But that did not sit well with the Indonesians, and Indonesia occupied the country. And that was when the fighting began. It was an insurrection that was truly terrible. The Indonesians were armed secretly by the United States, because if you think back to that period, 1975, that was a time when the Cold War was at its height.
Right.
And the people who were advocating most strongly for independence in East Timor were pretty left-leaning Marxists. Indonesia did not want a communist nation right on its doorstep, nor did Australia. And the United States, of course, at that time was very concerned about the domino theory, that country after country would fall to communism, and we ultimately would be in that line to fall as well. So the U.S. armed Indonesia, and the Indonesian military was in East Timor, and the result was truly horrific. Hundreds of thousands of people murdered or starved or displaced and so on. The place looks beautiful. It is an island nation, and it truly looks quite heavenly. Out in the remote areas, the lifestyle is far from developed. A 24-year-long genocide and a civil insurrection after that I'll speak about in a moment truly has meant that for the people in the rural area, which is about 90% of the population, there's very little access to sanitation, to clean water. At the end of the genocide period, there were almost no paved roads. At the end of post-independence fighting, there were no schools left. So this is a country that was truly devastated. You can see the countryside. It's primarily an agricultural economy. The people, as people everywhere, are beautiful. Farmland. The major export is coffee. Coffee is grown in the poorest of the world's countries for consumption in the richest. So for consumption in places like the United States, coffee is coming from Rwanda, from Vietnam, from other countries where life is much more difficult. The city, the capital city of Dili, is the most developed city, of course, on the island, and this is the beautiful Parliament building. We stayed not too far from here. And for those who are curious, it's a bit difficult to fly into East Timor First, you have to get to Indonesia and then fly from Indonesia into Dili, the capital. So it's a long trip. We visited the Bolide prison, and there's an exhibit there on the Commission for Reception, Truth, and Reconciliation that looks at what had happened during the genocide. And then in the year 2000, there was an effort to bring a vote, a referendum, on whether East Timor should become independent, a protectorate of Indonesia, or be fully absorbed. And again, when that vote happened in 2000, there was an outbreak of horrific violence, again with thousands of deaths. This is the current president. His name is Jose Ramos-Horta. In 1996, he became a Nobel Prize winner for his efforts at bringing peace to the country. And it's very interesting that at the time, I was living in Australia, as I mentioned, very near to East Timor. In 1995, I happened to go to a program in Australia about freedom for East Timor. And it was because of efforts by President Ramos-Horta that the issue of the persecution and the suppression of the East Timorese finally came to a full-blown head by the United States in Australia and in the United Nations, and that the referendum happened. The next series of pictures will show different NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or international organizations that have a very strong presence. So the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the United Nations still has a peacekeeping force of more than 3,000 people. They've got an Electoral Commission there that's working for a peaceful election coming up in 2012. There's an international stabilization force, largely staffed by people from New Zealand and Australia, in addition to the UN peacekeepers. As I mentioned, in 2000, there was a vote for independence, and there was horrific violence following that vote, which resoundingly showed the selection by the East Timorese for independence. 80% voted for independence. More than 1,000 people were slaughtered, schools were destroyed, everything was utterly demolished. And the UN, for the first time in history, came in full force and literally ran the entire country for 18 months. So the UN peacekeepers are still there, but that force is expected to be drawn down and eventually closed out in 2012 after the election, assuming that it goes peacefully. We were able to visit the New Zealand base and meet with many of the people in that stabilization force. This is a very religious country. It's very Catholic. One of only 2 Catholic countries in the Asian Pacific, of course, the Philippines as well. And I was there on a day that was a religious holiday, and there were literally thousands of people parading in the streets.
Wow.
You can't spit without hitting a UN vehicle.
Wow.
And it's very interesting that the presence of the UN in some ways is advantageous, in others is somewhat problematic. Now, the UN force, 3,000, is an enormous boon to the very developing economy. And I think it's very, very challenging to think of what that economic situation will be like when those peacekeepers are withdrawn.
Right.
There are many signs of interesting hope and progress. Arte Moris is a small arts organization right in Dili, the capital, and the focus is to engage youth in using art for peaceful expression, for peaceful purposes. This is a country that has known nothing but violence since 1975, and this is manifest in family violence, in domestic violence, in horrific gender-based violence, in youth solving problems through violence. So it's really essential, critical to this country that individuals, families, and communities learn to resolve their differences in other ways.
Right.
The dominant religion, as I said, is Catholicism. Other religions are beginning to come in. And this is what we see throughout the developing world in post-conflict situations. It's an opportunity for other faiths to come in to try to rebuild, but also to proselytize. And I connected with an NGO that's doing a lot of work in collaboration with Columbia University in New York and their efforts to promote human rights around the world. And there are problems now in some of the outlying districts where there are confrontations between those who are of one faith and those who are of another. During the freedom movement for all of those decades, Catholicism was at the heart of it because it was an organizing force, just like churches were during the civil rights movement in the South in this country. So a potential for seeds of yet more conflict. I visited a school, and this is a scene in a computer lab. This school had 3,000 students. It was a private Catholic school, perhaps a little better funded than the public schools. 3,000 students, and there were 2 toilets.
Wow.
Wow.
Now, an important thing to think about is what happens then to the young girls who every month are not able to take care of their hygiene needs. And the tragedy is that young girls wind up dropping out of school. The UN mission in East Timor, of course, has a strong presence. The country is trying to find ways to move forward and to promote tourism as a business that can help develop sustainability.
And there's Coca-Cola.
There was right, and there was a marathon that did bring in people from some of the neighboring countries, particularly Australia. Another NGO, of course, or another organization, is the European Union, and this is their headquarters in Dili. I was there and happened to have an opportunity to engage with some of the school kids. Children everywhere, of course, love to talk to people who are new to them. Just some highlights about the violence. An estimated 200,000 people killed, not only through direct extermination, as we have seen in other genocides, but also through starvation. People were displaced. There were internally displaced persons camps, even in the city of Dili, until just a few years ago. 40% of the country is under the age of 15, and the life expectancy is low. The literacy rate is low. There are still up to 100,000 people who are displaced from their own villages.
Wow.
So if we think about that, about a young population in a poor country with little opportunity, it means that the seeds are there for violence and for manipulation. This is what the population looked like in 1990. This is called a population pyramid. And it's showing on the left side the proportion of the population that's male, and on the right the females. Starting at the very bottom, it's people who are very young, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, in each of the color bars. And what you see in 1990 is a huge population growth. This is what it looks like for 2050.
Wow.
Wow.
Oh my
The
goodness,
country's going to
indeed.
explode in population.
With no way to sustain it, no
Right.
economic opportunity. Farming is very challenged.
Yeah.
Healthcare,
Right.
sanitation, clean water. So the future is very, very challenging.
With that information, if people want to learn more about it and want to follow maybe your other visits as well, where can we go to learn more?
Thank you for that. I recommend that people check in at our website, www.worldwithoutgenocide.org. The Center for Victims of Torture, which is headquartered in Minneapolis, has just sent a team to East Timor, looking to set up some resources there to address post-traumatic stress disorder. This is an entire country whose people are traumatized.
Right.
And how do we begin to help them move forward when the GDP per capita is $2,600? Almost half of the country is below the poverty line. 3% are horrifically poor. And the one resource that they have, which is oil, is hotly contested by the Indonesians and by the Australians. So it's a very difficult situation.
Well, thank you so much for coming and bringing this to our attention. Otherwise,
you.
it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell people in words, but the pictures really
Great, thank
huge
you.
make a huge difference. So thank you so much, and we hope to
you.
have you back on your next
you.
trip. And it sure
Thank
makes
you.
us appreciate what we have today, even though today in the United States things are tough. Not in comparison,
Not at
right?
all.
Exactly. So thank you for putting
you,
things in
Ellen.
perspective.
Thank you.